Welcome, 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 friend. I'm TK, your tour guide to the past, and you are listening to For the Love of History, the podcast where we talk about world history, women's history, and weird history, and author interviews. They are quickly becoming my favorite type of interview to do, and today we have the wonderful Anita Say Chan, author and scholar, an educator dedicated to feminist and decolonial approaches to technology. She is an associate professor of information sciences and media and the founder of Community Data Clinic at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I hope I said that last part right.
You did perfectly.
Awesome. Thank you. We're so happy to have you on, Anita. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, 2K.
So today we are going to be talking about Anita's book that has one of the most interesting titles I have ever read. But before we do that, let's talk about who Anita is. Let's get to know our wonderful guest. So Anita, please tell us about yourself. How did you get into your PhD of all of the science and media things that you do?
Well, I'm trained as a scholar of science and technology studies. There is such a thing, and it's an amazing field, I will say. I got my doctorate, my PhD at MIT in the US at a program called the History and Anthropology of Science and Technology Studies. It's a wildly and wonderfully interdisciplinary field. I imagine that lots of your listeners, TK, are also sort of interdisciplines, people who are sort of loving to kind of grab, not just staying in conversations that belong in supposedly one particular lane, but really sort of getting to bridge conversations and seeing the influences between different kinds of fields, sciences across and humanities, the way that these sorts of things that oftentimes are thought of as quite disparate and discrete, categories, the way that actually inflected across one another, the way science influences politics, the way politics influences science and technology. All of those things are the sorts of conversations that people in my field love to talk about. And for the last 10 or more years, I've been a faculty member at the University of Illinois, a wonderful public university, land-grant university in the center of Illinois, in the heartland of the US, and one with, I think, famously one of the largest international student bodies. One of the top programs. It's in large part due to the strength of STEM fields at our campus. I think we are well known for having one of the top computer science programs amongst various engineering fields, and also one of the top library and information sciences programs, which is where my appointment is in the School of Library and Information Sciences.
That's amazing. That is so cool. So I know we love interdisciplinary things here. We always say, the history people can't do it without the science people and vice versa. So we all need each other. And for my delicious donuts out there who are listening, you're probably like, what is a science person doing on the podcast right now? But wait, please wait. Because when I tell you the title of this book, maybe you have read it already in the title of the episode. I don't know what I'm going to title this episode yet, but you are going to know exactly why I said, yes, please. I would love to have Anita on. So the title of Anita's new book is Predatory Data, Eugenics in Big Tech and Our Fight for an Independent Future. When I read this title, I was like, what is she talking about? Eugenics in Big Tech? I know about eugenics. We've covered some episodes where we talk about eugenics, but eugenics in big tech, I was thoroughly confused and very intrigued. So to get us started today, I would love to know how you found a connection between eugenics and technology. How did that happen?
Well, the history is fairly thick and obvious. I think the reason I wrote the book was because my own astonishment at how few of my colleagues and students in information sciences were actually familiar with the history, despite the kind of thickness of the evidence trail and the notion that one of the kinds of standard methodologies that is used now across the data sciences, statistical regression, which is one of the kind of fundamental means by which prediction and datafied prediction happens. We're using online platforms, and platforms know what to serve up to us as sort of predicted content that supposedly is in line or in alignment with a particular person's tastes according to what their past patterns of use might have been, right? That's maybe one of the most familiar ways that we engage with as everyday online users, the kinds of, let's say, fruits of statistical regression. All of those methodologies are basically, that is the kind of fundamental baseline predictive methodology that's used for all of our kind of data platforms and prediction, again, online platforms and social media spaces. And that methodology is really over 100 years old and founded by a very well-known biostatistician, Francis Galton, who also happened to be a eugenicist, really the founder of the eugenics movement. Galton was the cousin to Charles Darwin, the famous Charles Darwin, of course, Origin of the Species and natural scientist. And he himself was, much like Darwin, from a kind of lettered, pedigreed family of the English elite, and really trying to sort of make a name for himself, sort of a dilettante in his day, unsure sort of what discipline to kind of focus himself in. And he sort of went around practicing various sorts of things, from meteorology to biostatistics to explorer sciences. And the thing that sort of connected all of his practices was his own obsession with data. And he was the founder of statistical regression, as well as the founder of the eugenics movement, and very much the kind of what drove his very founding of the methodology of statistical regression. Again, the same thing that drives so much of the content that we consume online nowadays, and the way that we are profiled as users as well online today. All of that the origins of that methodology of regression was essentially from Galton's and fellow eugenicists' own obsession and anxiety with the potential that their own race, as in well-born in quotes, elite, pedigreed, intelligent classes, scientific and knowledge classes, would potentially degenerate because of their growing proximity to new and diverse classes that were coming to populate urban London, new late 19th century America, where there was, again, an explosion of immigration, new patterns of globalization, various independence movements, of course, that were happening as colonies were fighting for their freedom and gaining freedom, and thereby gaining new opportunities for global mobility. This caused, of course, all kinds of new demographic changes all around the world, and especially in the West. And pedigree classes and scientists like Galton were especially worried about what that would mean for the survival of his own class. It was very much driven out of a white supremacist anxiety, and a specifically masculinist male one as well, as we'll get into in the conversation. But his obsession with counting was very much driven by that, and his obsession with finding and datifying populations was all coming from his own anxiety that there needed to be a means to stop or to press back on the kind of new flows of immigration and proximate diversification that he was witnessing happening in the cities. And in order to press back on that, eugenics was the kind of scientific movement that he came up with, essentially to start to advocate for not just the predictiveness and the predictability of population degeneracy, but also a movement to start to curtail that through using datification techniques, again, to demonstrate to policymakers what this kind of new mixing would lead to. Again, a kind of version of population degeneracy, and therefore to advocate for new policies around population segregation, immigration restrictions, even sterilization, all of this in the US. As the movement grew from the UK into the US, it was in the US actually where it was arguably the most successful in the decades leading up to the rise of the Nazi regime, which is where most of us are probably familiar. If we've heard of eugenics, usually it's associated with Nazi Germany, and the Third Reich, and of course the policies around segregation, sterilization, and extermination at scale that was happening. But we forget that actually the biggest experiment around eugenics policymaking and expansion was happening here in the US in the decades, again, before the rise of Nazi Germany. We're talking about from the late 19th century to the early decades of the 20th century. By the 1920s, 1930s, we had already had more than 30 states in the US that had passed sterilization laws for institutionalized peoples who supposedly were demonstrative of unfitness. That, again, the notion being that those populations were less deserving of being able to control their own reproductive freedom.
That's insane. One of the statistics in your book that really gave me pause was when you wrote that 3/4 of the universities, by a certain date, I'm sorry, I can't remember, but 3/4 of the universities in the United States were teaching eugenics.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. Eugenics is very much a kind of vanguard. Again, in the US, we primarily forget of how large it was as a movement here, in that we tend to think of it as a sort of fringe science, one that was only taken up by sort of quacks or used as a political expedient for opportunists, again, like Hitler and Nazi Germany, etc., without remembering how many successes it had had for decades in the US as the movement grew from the most elite corridors, Ivy League institutions, hundreds of universities in the US, public universities, elite universities in particular, graduates of Harvard, the first president of Stanford University, David Starr Jordan, various deans and presidents of Harvard University, Oliver Wendell Holmes, famously, who was the dean of Harvard Medical School, his son, the Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who became the famous Supreme Court judge case in the 1927 Bell versus Buck case, were essentially that upheld the legal status of forced sterilization in states. That was a court case that ended up coming up into the Supreme Court. And Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., again, a famous eugenicist, was the one who said 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. To enable exactly to essentially say that this forced sterilization of Carrie Buck was entirely within legal rights of the state. And yes, it was taught at hundreds of universities across the United States by the 1920s and throughout the 1930s, until that essentially the point where it started to sort of drop in popularity only after sort of media started to pick up on what the horrors of Nazi Germany were in the late 1930s and then moving into the 1940s. But it was quite the vanguard in the United States in the 19-teens and 1920s, and thought of in very similar ways, as I write in the book, and very similar ways that we think of data science today as sort of a very vanguard edge of practice, a kind of thing that the lettered classes and the elite and anyone who is interested in sort of helping to define or lean into the future of what our nation is going to be, right? Technology tends to be that. Data science tends to be exactly that. It is a thing that, of course, why would you? You should be in the know about this thing, and why would you contend with it? It was precisely the reason why back in the day, eugenics was very, very widely taught in universities, precisely with the notion that it is the responsible thing for us to teach the sons and daughters of lettered classes this kind of practice, again, as a means of leaning into the strength of the nation, the betterment of the American population, that this is all done, and again, as a means to be able to uplift the moral, intellectual, and physical character of the nation. And it was in particular amongst research and lettered scientific classes that the practice really first spread, and that advocacy networks then to sort of look towards politics to say that we, of course, can gain certain sorts of things as researchers if we organize ourselves and have eugenics conferences, as eugenicists did. There were international conferences in eugenics that various Americans, not only hosted, but were active participants in, again, throughout the 19-teens, 20s, and 30s. But we can only go so far with the kinds of research organizations and networks that we have. We really need to, if we're really trying to institute a eugenic society and build out the kind of eugenic utopia that they imagined, we need to look to policymakers and start to implement some of our recommendations through changing law. And so, as I write as well in the book, their datification techniques were not just used to sort of create research documents and surveys, medical surveys, population surveys, for which the data would be written up only for fellow researchers to consume. A lot of the data was written up very much to target policymakers and very effectively lobby for new kinds of laws, whether, as I write in the book, the first immigration bans initially around the Chinese in the 1870s and 1880s with the Chinese Exclusion Acts, where again the Chinese were excluded from entry because of the sort of unfitness of their character and under the notion that they would contaminate the good blood of a well-born white families because of sort of the risk of Chinese prostitutes and the kind of risk that proximity of Chinese laboring classes would have to well-born white families. And then later, the kinds of immigration bans that we saw in 1917 and 1924, where organizations like the Eugenics Research, I'm getting their name. Why am I getting their name?
That's okay.
Eugenics Research. I was going to say their Eugenics Record Office. Oh my gosh. I was almost
there you go.
The Eugenics Research Organization. Eugenics Record Office, founded famously by Charles Davenport and Henry Lawlin. Davenport, a former professor and graduate of Harvard University, who ended up again founding this research organization, but also an organization that understood its role as well as a lobbying outfit that made the passage of immigrant exclusion acts based on their unfitness one of its core lobbying mantras. So they were quite successful in helping to, for instance, in the weeks leading up to the passage of the 1917 Immigration Exclusion Act, the first major exclusion act in the US that is installed quotas, immigration quotas. We may be familiar with them. These are the ones that the first time that they were instituted, but also the first ones that essentially designed and privileged are those who we would let in, immigrants that were allowed to come in, to be ones that had a Northern Europeans and Nordic, quote unquote, Nordic races. And that were the quotas were also explicitly designed to exclude Southern Europeans, Jewish immigrants, of course, almost all Asian immigrants and African, Latinx, etc. But again, it was all the quotas were all designed around the kind of essentially a eugenic image of the nation. And organizations like the Eugenics Record Office were quite savvy at, again, being able to repackage data that they had collected and data that had been published by other eugenicists, like Madison Grant, a famous eugenic author of the day as well, who had written that the book, The Passing of the Great Race, reprinting images from the book that were maps of European migration that eugenicists argued essentially could demonstrate new patterns of migration that they argued would also prove a future degeneracy or degeneration of what was of the population in the US if immigration quotas and exclusions weren't put in place. They blew those sort of data visuals and infographics up and lined the halls of Congress with them, again, as this sort of persuasive act to target their messages quite effectively to policymakers and legislators. They not only effectively managed to get the 1917 ban to be racialized in the way that I had mentioned, but they also excluded through correlations of what they said was biological unfitness and mental unfitness with things like political dissent. And proclivity to, of course, pauperism, in other words, poverty and criminality. These were sort of the kinds of predictions that eugenicists were famous for making and attempted to prove through their data. And so they also managed to get into place bans on people who had records of political dissent and the right to be able to deport anyone who had a record of political dissent as well.
Wow. A lot of what you're saying very much resonates with things that are happening recently with people in these, in that time, eugenics positions. And now here in big tech positions, there's a lot of lobbying going on, a lot of pushing, politics one way or another to kind of create, the environment that we have right now. So I would love to know what exactly big tech eugenics is. So we know that eugenics, when we think about it, it's very plainly, not to go into too much detail, but the selective breeding, for a lack of a better word, of humans to create, air quotes, what the few elite people thought were the best type of people.
Right.
So
yes,
techno-eugenics is kind of a hard concept to wrap my head around at the beginning, and I imagine some listeners as well. So what is that? What is techno-eugenics?
It happens in lots of different ways, but much like eugenics was sort of a spectrum, techno-eugenics was also a spectrum. So just to remind folks, and the book sort of gets into this as well, eugenics had a whole kind of line of folks who were sort of acolytes and believers, let's say, in eugenics. There were, of course, a sort of very, very hard line, let's say pro-sterilization immediately, and of course, even pro-extermination of like the sort of as a kind of eugenic policy. In other words, that the unfit and those who we could predict to be unfit should not have the right to procreate and potentially not even the right to exist, right? So that's one version of hardline eugenics. There are others who were also much softer, and folks who sort of believed instead in sort of like segregation of classes, discouraging people from having the free ability to sort of procreate or to couple on their own, right? So softer means of being able to do that sort of thing. And you could so too, but at the end of the day, still believing in a version of course, the better society is one, and the best society, what we eventually want to get to, is a version of strength and prowess of the nation and heightened productivity, all through this notion of, yes, there can be a correlation, or a predictable correlation between biological constitution and intellectual, physical, and moral fitness, right? That was the sort of fundamental of eugenicists. And you could say that techno-eugenics similarly has a kind of spectrum, right? So that there are some softer versions of it, and there are some harder versions of it. And I'll describe that kind of spectrum to your readers, who will probably, or to your listeners, who will probably be able to sort of recognize who amongst our kinds of, let's say, now quite well amplified Silicon Valley tech elites where they fall along that spectrum. It can be so the softest versions of what I write about and depict as a version of techno-eugenics, and to underscore, is to remind people that when companies are coming up with constitutions around how to moderate online fora, recognizing that there can be a harm, they're doing this all through their safety teams. And the reason why they know that there can be a harm is because we have seen in national context after national context, especially through the 1910s and 19-teens, what happens when you have content that is completely unmoderated, when essentially you have users being able to amp up and to amplify at scale what kind of, through some version of popular speech, or sort of, again, amplified speech through metrics. The kinds of speech that can get easily amplified is one that falls in line with majoritarian politics, and that oftentimes ends up constituting a version of hate speech, right? So you end up having, and it looks different across various nations. And the problem is, as we have seen, and as became a kind of point of international controversy when the Facebook papers were leaked in 2019 by Frances Haugen. Some of your listeners might remember that as well. But amongst the things that were disclosed was how much Facebook workers, let's say, as one company that whose policies one might describe as techno-eugenicists, that Facebook workers themselves were disclosing and were crying out to company leaders that their own policies of under moderation of forum was causing deadly mob violences against minoritized populations all across India.
Yeah.
So what we had essentially were minorities in India, the world's largest democracy, dominant nation. But in context after context, province after province, what we saw were hundreds of cases of mobs attacking minoritized populations, largely in these cases, largely Dalit or Muslim populations, or people who had been accused of being Muslim or Dalit because they were sort of unknown and traveling through an area or through a province without any sort of local contact. But a rumor would start on social media that someone had been spotted, that they had been spotted either trying to kidnap or trying to seduce a Hindu child or a woman, and suddenly a mob would arise. It sounds like something surreal or out of sci-fi. It was happening in literally hundreds of contexts and was getting reported by global nonprofit workers and human rights organizations, because the victims of these kinds of violences were everyone as young from 12-year-old boys to Google workers. I mean, it was not something that was hard to see. If you were part of a news reading public in India, and some of the incidences were even reported in the pages of the New York Times.
Wow.
So, and in other cases and contexts, famously in Burma and Myanmar with the Rohingya Muslim population, again, another sort of, one could say, exterminationist, even genocide campaign is what NGOs and human rights workers were describing. And all of it being waged very much publicly through social media channels where hate speech was getting amplified, where campaigns were getting amped up and escalated through, again, mediated exchange very, very publicly, none of it tamped down, to basically target the Rohingya Muslim minoritized population there, who were all being accused of some version of supposed cultural threat against the majority population, again, a Buddhist population. It made very, very little sort of cultural sense. I mean, in the context of sort of, again, numbers of what the Rohingya might have been able to ever in anyone's imagination actually execute, but it didn't matter. All of these things escalated, and you could see again in all of those cases and others that I cite in the book, I think I cite as well, cases in Ethiopia and across the global context, the notion of, again, majoritarian politics escalating in social media spaces, oftentimes, or in all of these cases, quite publicly, to target minoritized populations and being used as a tool by governments in authoritarian contexts, again, to really shore up a kind of populist support for their own governments, and instrumentalizing essentially a kind of campaign against a minority threat, again, in order to sort of shore up that political power. But it was all being waged quite publicly, and workers themselves at these companies were, again, underscoring the need for more safety protocols, for any kind of investment in safety protocols. At the time, I think the numbers were, and they may have changed since then, but the numbers that were being reported were that 84% of Facebook's investment in safety and security policies for users were all being invested only in the United States, despite the fact that, of course, they've got a large global user base, are very popular, are essentially the backbone of the internet in India, and that the rest of the world essentially gets 16% of whatever that safety investment was. We should all keep in mind, of course, right. Oh my God. Right. Okay. So when Facebook workers were saying we need more safety protocol, it might have been as simple as let's have a single worker on our safety team who actually speaks Burmese.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That's a very, like, the bar is under the ground kind of situation. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Given how much profit these companies are making, the notion that they were leaving and that they are usurping really the spaces that once upon a time had been taken up by legitimate news channels and news organizations that are, of course, attendant to and based in national populaces, that are responsible to and that are really governed by local laws. Facebook, of course, has none of that. None of our social media companies have any accountability to local laws, really. And so what we saw, again, was really companies making decisions based on profit motive and where it, from their interest, it was worth their investment to secure and create safe environments for users. And as we could see, despite the kind of outcries by nonprofit workers and their own workers within the company itself, very little, if anything, was done within these global contexts, again, to re-secure populations. If anything, there, as we could see later, there was instead very public brokering between Mark Zuckerberg and Narendra Modi, who is the Hindu nationalist leader of India. Again, so very friendly, one might say, kowtowing to Modi, essentially to maintain the status of the very privileged status of Facebook as essentially the backbone of the internet in India. So rather than, again, investing in any kind of sort of message for pluralism and protection, and essentially sort of even backing up what the calls and recommendations were from his own internal engineers were, instead leaning in exactly the opposite direction. So there's that one sort of, I mean, there's a version of Techno-Eugenics that looks simply kind of like a calculation around, that looks on its surface simply like a calculation for capitalism. Where is it worth it to invest in safety and security protocols? And where are we, is it okay for essentially us to write off this collateral damage, even if the collateral damage is essentially some version of international genocide?
Yeah.
And other versions of it, of course, has become very, very public in US politics in the last election cycle, for sure, presidential election cycle, but that had actually been prominent even in the previous one, and that, as I argue in the book, had been prominent and present in Silicon Valley well before the kind of rightward turn that we now see with heads of companies of platforms like X and Tesla, and investors like Peter Thiel, and of course a kind of whole coterie of various Silicon Valley heads now attending, MAGA and Donald Trump inauguration. Their investments behind MAGA candidates became very public in this last election cycle. It had, of course, started in 2016. We saw Peter Thiel as actually a speaker at the Republican National Convention in 2016. He was already making investments and funding the campaigns before his very successful funding of course, J.D. Vance and his rise to the role of vice president, and of course the kind of very friendly relationship between Donald Trump and Elon Musk. But we had seen much of that sort of rightward turn happening really years before. And you could see it in early advocacy of figures like Peter Thiel from the 2000s, from 2009, certainly, and onward, where he started to become a much stronger advocate for the breakdown of democratic institutions. So one of the things that unites techno-eugenicists and past eugenicists across the spectrum is really a disdain and revile for democratic institutions, and a belief that their own privileged status and especially their conceit and their self-imagination as amongst the smartest and the best and the brightest men on the planet should give them the right and the free reign to govern. And even if they have zero record for being able to either maintain or care about public safety at scale and the public safety of diverse publics, right? None of these men have any record of doing that at all, or any evidence of doing that. Nonetheless, they insist that their intelligence and or what they constitute to be their supreme intelligence and their exceptionalism gives them the right to be able to experiment with publics at scale and even govern publics at scale, and all without any kind of check or oversight by democratic institutions. So Silicon Valley companies, including all of our favorite big tech companies, have been quite famous for lobbying against any kind of regulation around speech, of course. We now see AI companies having done exactly the same thing, even under the Biden administration, where even safety protocols and new legislation that would have been introduced to essentially just put in place some common sense language for safety in the AI industry. All of that had been lobbied very aggressively against, was being lobbied in opposition and to be opposed through big tech companies, whether from OpenAI to Microsoft, again, all with the notion that these companies should be able to essentially have free reign to be able to experiment on publics at scale. We should of course keep in mind, and I'm sure it's not something that is surprising for any of your listeners to think about, but what we have essentially built out through social media platforms and the internet is the largest infrastructure for real-time experimentation with human populations at scale. And most of these companies are doing it A/B testing on populations on the fly constantly without any version of regulation or oversight. And they do that now, although safety and security teams have been really sort of the inside ethicists for social media companies. They are all being disinvested in and being broken down, especially under this new administration. But one could say that even the small investment that companies had been making in them was more for show than it was for actually instituting and putting into practice global safety. There really wasn't any version of global safety. There was a version of striated and conditional safety depending on where you lived, such that Western users got a version of Facebook and social media, and everyone else essentially got an entirely different version.
Yeah, it's very interesting because I live in Japan, and so being on social media in Japan is very different than being on social media in the United States. And there is a lot more like Japanese, of course, there wouldn't be Japanese nationalistic things in the United States because that's not the demographic. But here you can see a lot, especially on Facebook, not so much on Instagram, but definitely on TikTok and Facebook, a lot of nationalistic ideas, a lot of anti-Chinese, anti-Korean sentiment type content on Facebook and TikTok.
Yes,
It's
yeah. We're going to
completely
start to
different.
see a version of majoritarian politics escalate in the US in ways that we hadn't. Once, I mean, essentially, Facebook has already made the announcement that it's going to be dissolving its safety team as of March. So
Yeah.
we will absolutely be seeing a very different kind of social media environment, and it will
Yeah.
likely not be one that is particularly friendly for many. If people are uncomfortable with what traffic looks like on X, we will start seeing some version of that really start to play out on much wider spectrum.
Yeah, and already, like, as a person who is very much online, my job is online, very social network forward. There is, and me myself as extremely privileged, even myself face a lot of hate and backlash with the subjects that I talk about, and it goes doubly for
TK. Yeah, absolutely.
it's
I mean,
insane.
and it's not a surprise. I mean, it is because the way eugenicists and techno-eugenicists sort of imagine who should be in control is it's a radical version of elitism. It is an absolutely radical version of elitism, right? I mean, they were anti-black and brown, of course, but also deeply masculinist. I don't know what the language for extreme ableism is, but I mean, they waged campaigns. Much of their campaigns were around any version of mental, physical, moral unfitness. So every version of supposed, human failing, quote unquote failing in their book should be something that should be excised, that we should have little tolerance for, because it could not be utilized as something that would make the nation stronger and fitter. When we hear this language coming back into play, you've literally heard now the new administration, exactly in the sort of wake of the DC helicopter plane accident, the new administration state that such accidents wouldn't have happened if we had more natural geniuses in guarding plane traffic. That exact language, natural geniuses, comes exactly from Sir Francis Galton in his earliest publications around the notion of being able to predict hereditary talent and genius. And so one should keep in mind that very much part of this is also out of their own kind of insecurity, once again, of how threatened they are by democratic institutions and by democratic publics. Again, a lot of their sort of extremism and hate is one that's very much built on a kind of fundamental questioning of their own, one might say, a fundamental questioning of their own right to privilege. One could certainly see that in Galton's biography, that he sort of needed to come up with eugenics as a means to sort of prove not just that all these other classes were predictably unfit, but also that classes like him were also genuinely and empirically entitled and fitter. And he would obsess about this, I mean, literally until his dying day. Just as a nod again to sort of the connection between past eugenics and techno-eugenicists, and that question that you were leading to, TK, around who are these guys and the kind of gendered nature of their politics, and how it's not, I mean, it's no coincidence that even, as you were saying, I mean, being a relatively privileged person, even relatively privileged people, all women in one way or another, were thought of as really tools and subjects for control by people like Galton. He, in many ways, was the original tech bro. One of the first things, again, obsessed with numbers and loved to count everything. He would publish papers even on things like how to make the perfect cup of tea, the number of stirs and the amount of sugar that you would use, right? So everything was countable for him. But famously, one of the other things that he insisted was countable was beauty and the distribution of beauty across London. So he created a secret counter, a handheld counter that was basically, you would count through pinpricks in a little piece of paper. He would hold it in his pocket and stand on the corners of various neighborhoods in London to count supposedly the number of attractive women, according to him, in various neighborhoods in London, with the notion that, of course, quote unquote, better neighborhoods had higher correlations for beauty. And so this was, right, again, part of his argument that fitness could be predicted and that it correlated with the privileged already, right? The privileged were privileged because they were genetically endowed for it. The poor were poor because of their own fault and because they were also
Yeah.
genetically endowed for that. And you could continue to predict that. It would be predictable. Pauperism, criminality. So you could start to count it in populations. And once you counted enough, you would start to see that all of this was correlated. And so very, very deeply kind of, I don't know, obsessed with his own sort of the gendered nature of his privilege, obviously feeling like that was something, that kind of creepiness was something he should be endowed to do. Even though he sort of obviously knew that it wasn't proper, because that's why the counter was secret, right? I mean, he had some inkling that this was inappropriate.
Yeah.
And until so that was the young Galton, but he would continue to have these kinds of antics until literally his dying day. He would, until his death, he was working on a famous sci-fi volume, which was based on a eugenic society in can't say where, in an area called can't say where.
Okay.
And the whole imaginary was that eugenics scientists, the whole sci-fi premise was based on this notion of having eugenic scientists being able to control the reproductive futures of young people in this village or in this society, whereby the scientists could decide which beautiful woman got to couple with which men.
Wow.
Again, like deeply, deeply pathological, but also one where you can see the anxieties around supposedly the kind of lack of privilege that he had, right? I mean, this is all again happening in Galton's own head, but how that translates again to that conceit of how one's own endowed stature, the amount of control that it should give one, the right to control. This is really an argument that eugenicists were making back in the day, elite men of science, that they should have the right to control without oversight the lives for the betterment of society. This is the way that the best society comes into play. And it is by no coincidence, right? We're seeing this play out again by people like Elon Musk, really, who has argued, of course, for his own office in the White House, to be able to give direct guidance to the new administration, right? Sort of front row guidance. And we're already seeing some of that supposed good advice play out. Yeah. But this is not the first time that this has happened. And they are literally taking their playbook. You can already tell that not just in the language and the speech, but of course in the kind of actions that they are taking their playbooks and very likely reading at least excerpts of past eugenicists. It is astounding. Great replacement theory, the good blood, bad, but all the metaphors you hear them using, all of that is literally coming straight out of eugenics. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. And it's surpassed dog whistle now.
Oh,
They're just outright saying it. It's no longer a secret thing. It's just it's what they're saying.
Open. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Wow. I mean, he famously, there was reporting, of course, on Musk leading up to before his kind of very public kind of endorsement of Donald Trump, but also some reporting on on Musk's own strange gendered relations, that he was known to be kind of predatory for female employees, approaching female employees at SpaceX to have his children. And also very publicly advocating to his employees that they should be having more children to save civilization, that civilization would be on the downfall. Western civilization would fall because we are not, the right people essentially are not having enough children, and that other people, the undeserving, are having too many children. And so literally advocating for more kind of reproductive activity, supposedly for the making of a more intelligent society. I mean, so again, like light nods to this kind of thing, you could sort of see it, but it's not. And of course, his own sort of amplification of white supremacists, the kind of allowing and reinstantiation of all of their accounts back on X when he came onto the platform, his general disdain, of course, I mean, like for years leading up to, again, the kind of explicit endorsement of MAGAism, his not just disdain for organizations that were pro-civil rights and that were pro a kind of protection of minoritized populations, but also an accusal of them that they were trying to destroy Twitter and X. So he would make accusations of this for organizations that were pro-Jewish rights or pro-African-American rights, saying that they were on a mission to destroy Twitter. Nonprofits that like literally, this is the richest man on the planet, and his imagination that nonprofits that are working in the interest of minoritized populations, like literally from teeny tiny offices, somehow are on this sort of have escalated this mission to destroy Twitter. It's
insane.
Right. But it gives you a sense of really their own sense, his own sense of privilege, and the conceit again that he should be able, that it is offensive to have any version of check or oversight, and that any version of that is somehow a kind of misuse and misappropriation of energy and resources.
Wow. When I was reading the book, there was a very noticeable theme of fear among these big tech people. They're so afraid of losing power and losing what they have created as privilege for themselves, and that pedestal that they have put themselves on.
That's right.
Yes, it all seems to come from fear.
That's right. You're a really great reader, TK. It is.
Thank you.
Politics of anxiety. It is and it's their game is to try and translate that to users right now, even with eugenicists in the US in the late 19th and early 20th century. I write about them as really successful because they maintained their campaign for almost 50 years, right? I mean, they were sort of very public, again, in the most public, well-endowed, empowered political corridors of the US. I mean, they had research organizations that were getting national funding. They were instituted and very effectively lobbied, obviously, national politicians. They were in the, teaching courses and were leading American higher education institutions. They were by no means working in secret, but grew their movement across the decades by essentially continuously testing the American appetite for their kind of rhetoric. It was a consistent sort of testing and prodding to see how far could we take this? Whose rights can we continue to take away first? They didn't try to take away Southern immigrants and exclude Southern immigrants first. They worked with a population that was much easier to target and to demonize, which were the Chinese coming in through California. And I write obviously in the book about how the Chinese Exclusion Acts were very much a product of eugenic lobbying and very much based first on a notion of genetic deterioration or deterioration of the blood and contamination of our population through proximity to first Chinese prostitutes and then to laboring classes. And obviously, although oftentimes we think of the Chinese Exclusion Acts in shorthand in American history as things as national new legislation that was gained because of sort of Chinese competition with American miners and new laboring laboring classes in the West, when you look at the history of Chinese Exclusion Acts and see that the first Exclusion Act, our first Immigration Exclusion Act ever instituted in the United States at all, was not against Chinese men who were supposedly competition for the working classes. It was against Chinese women who were not posing any kind of labor competition. The risk that they were posing was supposedly to well-born American heterosexual families. That was literally the studies that were coming out of California legislature or for California legislators that were coming from medical officials of the day who testified to convince legislators that really almost all of our kind of venereal diseases, sexually transmitted diseases were coming from this population of Chinese women and that it was being spread because of their hereditary proclivities towards vice and towards criminality, et cetera, and unhealth. In any case, and we are once again seeing some version of, again, a language to exclude certain immigrant classes precisely based on some version of underfitness and unworthiness, and a means to bring in good immigrants. You literally see that kind of language once again, and it is not an accident. No, it is not. Wow. Anita, I could literally talk to you all day about this, but I want to kind of pivot a little bit to the more positive side of your book, because I don't want readers to think that it's all doom and gloom and awful and they're just going to feel sad at the end of the book. Absolutely not. You're going to feel sad for about halfway through. And then there's a fabulous pivot to the fight for independence, which is in the title of your book. That's right. And so I would love to kind of
bring our conversation to a close in a positive way? And what sort of things can we do, or what sort of things did you write in your book that we can do or that people are doing for their fight for independence?
Well, I will make a nod to the notion that building some of these feminist networks and sort of new knowledge practices, making sure that we are aware of our history is one of those things. So I write about it in the book, and thanks TK for sort of underscoring that it's not all gloom.
It's not.
But really, the second half of the book is really dedicated to other forms of feminist and decolonial data practice, because those traditions, just as long and deep as the history of eugenics in the US and the kinds of predatory data practices that eugenicists were up to, so too is a history of alternative data methods, especially in a kind of image of feminist data practice and data practice for new kinds of solidarities, including with immigrant populations in the US. That is incredibly long and thick as well. As one case study, I look into the history of Hull House, which is a 19th century kind of famous settlement house that was based in Chicago. It was really one of the leading settlement houses in the US. Settlement houses the movement grew out of the UK as well at the turn of the 20th century, really as sort of a means to kind of address growing problems around urbanism. And Hull House was one of the most well-known ones in the US, in part because it was founded by two feminists and queer as well researchers, famously Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr, who cultivated a community of largely women, amateur researchers, but also immigrants who were coming in and living in the neighborhood of the 19th Ward in Chicago, and who were dedicating their lives to essentially some version, or part of their careers to some version of data collection in neighborhoods, sometimes with fellow neighbors, but to document conditions of sweatshops and working classes and exploitation of the working poor in their own neighborhood. The 19th Ward was largely a kind of immigrant-based Southern Eastern Europeans, families of all kinds, Jewish families, etc., were living in the 19th Ward, many of them in deeply, deeply distressing kinds of situations. And the researchers at Hull House were really dedicating their work to trying to document through both quantitative and qualitative surveys of family life what were the impacts of working in sweatshops? What were the correlations around childhood deformities? What were the wages that average households were given? And then with those wages, what kind of living conditions were they only able to afford? And so part of what they were able to document through that kind of datification was that the conditions of the working poor are not because of some sort of biological degeneracy. The conditions of the working poor are being forced upon them through labor exploitation. And here's what that looks like. And here's how that correlates to things like childhood deformities and deformities of bodies because of the kinds of forms of extreme exploitation that you're seeing on even children as young as 2 and 3. And so because of Hull House, and the kinds of research they were doing, the data that they were collecting, they were also up to publishing data visualizations and infographics, or what we contemporarily might think of as infographics, so colored wage maps and those sorts of things, trying to popularize the circulations of that kind of literacy of who the working poor were. And they managed to effectively get new labor laws in place, things that we take for granted today. The 8-hour workday laws, non-childhood labor laws, exclusions of, women who were in different stages of maternity, etc. All of those things were workplace safety laws, non-exposure to chemicals, and things that would really literally kill young workers in their 20s. So all of those things were a credit to the kind of alternative research practices and feminist research practices of Hull House residents and researchers working again in solidarity with other immigrant researchers and other immigrant families who were living in the neighborhood. They were very, very successful, to the point where very esteemed departments of sociology, were like the one at the University of Chicago, was very well known for paying attention, keeping tabs on the developments that were coming out of Hull House, and also eventually modeling the kinds of surveys that they would come to be famous for as statistical surveys, as community surveys and research on working neighborhoods. They would also end up adopting a lot of the output. So Hull House's mark on not just legislative reform, but also knowledge practice is deep. Their graduates went on to be co-founders and playing leading roles in organizations from the NWA to the Progressive Party. It was an extremely successful community network that, again, we oftentimes forget about, much as we forget about the kind of depth of eugenics history. And Hull House was also deeply anti-eugenicist, obviously, but refused to get absorbed into dominant academic institutions of the day. There were a number of different invitations coming from the University of Chicago, but they would insist that their place was to be independent as researchers and to be as close to the community as possible. To be embedded in the community. Nowadays, I mean, moving forward, we see any number of different organizations still working with these kinds of solidarities. I call them data solidarities because you could see different kinds of expertises and interdisciplines of the researchers who were working in Hull House. There were math students like Alice Holbrook who were also artists, and all of those identities would come to play when they were coming up with the data visualizations and wage maps that were famously published and did their work through Hull House Mops and Papers volume and the research publications. There were mothers like Frances Kelly who would insist that her identity as a mother was part as well of why she was so successful as a kind of advocate for labor, and who would bring those things together. So any number of different, again, sort of mixed identities and disciplines, and people who weren't sort of only trying to sort of stay in one lane, recognizing how their reform could only be cultivated through bringing conversations together. In any case, we see that happening now with various kinds of different critical data initiatives that are pro some version of technological use and infrastructures, but are really sort of underscoring that data can be collected in different ways, and it matters who the researchers are, who they're in conversation with, the kinds of communities they see themselves as accountable to. So when you hear about organizations like Data for Black Lives or the Global Indigenous Data Alliance or Our Data Bodies, these are all sorts of, again, different instantiations of critical data and alternative data traditions that I argue are working in alignment with these, feminist data traditions from over 100 years ago.
I'm so glad that you also brought in your book the positive things and the history that there has always been a positive force to a negative force that's going on. And I think that is fabulous. And in our society today, I think it's really easy to focus on the negative, right? Algorithms on YouTube and Instagram and Facebook are very hate and negativity driven.
Yes.
And it's really easy to forget that there are organizations, there are people out there like the organizations that you listed today that are making a positive change.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's the tip of the iceberg. I mean, I think they're happening, and there's so many organizations and local communities, and some of them don't even have data in their name. I'll give an example right now. In Urbana-Champaign, the area that I live, there are various collectives, social collectives, especially ones who are working in organizations that exist to essentially serve underserved populations, families that are close to the poverty line or the working poor. But in any case, and any number of them that are working in alliance with organizations like our local ACLU and local other organizations or academics that have an expertise around surveillance technologies, working to lobby for local level legislation to make sure that there is some version of oversight when local government and police departments start to invest financial resources and taxpayer dollars into the acquisition of more surveillance technologies. Obviously, there's a lot of worry about that right now with the particular timing of the shift to the new administration and what it means, that the risk is that datafying populations at scale will obviously also impact the parts of our communities that are also hyper vulnerabilized, and that extra data can be used in a way against exactly those members of our community in ways that right now are being questioned in terms of the constitutionality of that. But again, recognizing that data can be vulnerabilizing, and it really does depend on standpoint and situatedness, and trying to, again, create some public oversight around the kind of control of datification infrastructures through channels that may not, again, be publicly accountable to local communities' democratic processes. That's what I think what's happening, what various organizations and various communities are now trying to stand up against. So just to say that a lot of this work as well around trying to remake data infrastructures or hold data infrastructures accountable are happening all across our communities. Pay attention to what's happening, I would say, in your own local community, because I guarantee you that the conversation is happening someplace. It's not always happening through an organization like some of the ones that I have mentioned that are well known through various organizing circles, but who have, let's say, data in or technology in their name. A lot of our local advocates are working through local infrastructures of expertise and knowledge that are essentially credentialized through their service to underserved parts of our population.
Yeah, that's incredible. I'm so glad that there's organizations like that. And knowing that there are things at a local level for myself is very reassuring, because I know, especially with the climate of everything that is going on in the world, there are so many things that are happening and a lot of people feel helpless and they don't really know what to do, because it seems like such a huge problem, a huge scale of what the issue is. And I guess for my final question for you today, is there something and any advice that you can give to the everyday person on what they can do to fight against this, or to protect themselves, or to reclaim their own data?
Yeah, know your history, I would say, and you don't have to imagine or to think that the version of a technological future that we're being sold through these big tech companies and through the technological elite, they are not the only pathway to the future. There are plenty of other researchers who are working to develop who have already developed, not only already developed alternative research infrastructures, but who themselves oftentimes, are getting drowned out because of all the attention that's being foisted onto these extremely, extremely wealthy and elite sectors of society that do not represent everything that's going on by any means. And as a very, very obvious example, the controversy around Stargate and the notion that this large investment was being made by the US around essentially a kind of supposedly inevitable, what had been sold and promoted as an inevitable AI infrastructure, that we have to build AI this way because there's no other way to do it. Literally within a week of that announcement, of Stargate's announcement, we see a number of different papers and models being developed alternatively in what was once upon a time the global south, but in China, essentially demonstrating not only that it can be done with a lot less energy intensiveness, but also a lot for investors, a lot more. That this notion that this was the only model possible, and the amount of investment that was being foisted and really constricted and absorbed just in that one space, because essentially they had managed to suck the room, that all other conversation had gotten shut down. All the air had gotten sort of only sucked into that one sort of channel of future making. The falseness of that and the danger of listening to that over and over again, and exactly what gets shut out is what we saw play out. And that happens over and over again. Just to say that we don't need to, as a public, it matters who we believe are sort of architects of future making. And they wouldn't be, I think, TK, as you mentioned, there is an anxiety and fear that's fundamental to this kind of practice. And they are wanting to try and distribute that kind of fear and to try and insist that sort of fear is warranted, in a sense, make that go viral. But they have not set the status quo yet. And so long as we can make sure that we really are genuinely informed members of the public, know our history, and pay attention to other things that are going on around us, and invest in your own, again, local networks and alternative infrastructures for new knowledge futures. I think, again, even if it's in this way of maintaining feminist knowledge, conversation around feminist histories, that too is that kind of practice. So anyway, I'll leave it at that.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Anita. I really appreciate you coming on, doing research like this. It's so important to have diverse ideas and opinions and books and I just appreciate you taking so much time to create this book and do this research and put this information out there and come on to the podcast to spread this knowledge. And once again, Anita's book is Predatory Data, Eugenics in Big Tech, and Our Fight for an Independent Future. So thank you. I could gush all day long about how much I love this book. So please go check it out. All of Anita's information and where to purchase the book and the resources that we talked about earlier will be linked in the show notes below. And thank you so much, Anita.
Thank you, TK. And I'll also mention the book is also open access, available via open access. So you can go to the University of California's website and download a free version as a PDF or an EPUB version. So for folks in global corners of the world for whom it's a little bit harder to rely on different supply chains and whatnot, you can get a free copy of the book as well. And I encourage that too.
Yeah, awesome. I will put that in the show notes as well. And I highly encourage everybody to read this book. Truly, seriously, prepare for a little bit of sad, but then a bit of hope at the end. So
thanks, TK.
Of course. Thank you so much. And I will see you in the outro. Bye. And to Anita for coming onto the podcast. Her book, I cannot stress this enough, is incredible and so very timely. And I highly recommend that you read it. It's free. It's a free book. It's an open access book. You can go to the show notes below. You can download it. If you got any PDF reader type of a situation, you're good to go. You can just read it. It's absolutely excellent. And I guarantee that you will learn so much. So thank you for listening to this episode. Remember, we are on the season break right now. I am recouping and recording for season 11. But if you would like to listen to some other episodes, we have so many other episodes. You can get all caught up on your For the Love of History podcast episodes. And if you haven't gone over to YouTube yet, if you're not listening to this over on YouTube, head on over there. Watch some episodes. They're great. It's fun to see my hand movements. I talk a lot. I'm very handsy when I talk. Not that kind of handsy. You know what I mean. Anyways, if you'd like to support the podcast, please consider leaving a rating or review or both, leaving a comment on this podcast episode on Spotify or over on YouTube. You can join us over on Patreon. Lots of fun things happen over there. We are going to be starting a new little series. We've got ad-free listening. We've got early access. We've got live events. We're watching a movie together later on next month, May. May is the month that we will be watching stuff together. So thanks so much for supporting the podcast. Also, there's merch. I haven't talked about that in a long time. There's merch. You should go over there, do the thing. It's really great. I love you so much. Drink your water. Drink some things. Go outside. Touch some grass. I love you so much, and I hope you're having a great time. And I'll talk to you later. Okay, love you. Bye. Why is there a metronome right now? Oh, okay.